Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful that you have decided to join me as I do an actual proper book review. I make videos about every single book that I read, but most of the time it's just me talking about things that kind of struck me as I was reading the book, and I don't really do formal reviews. But after reading all 2,223 pages of the Licanius Trilogy, which consists of The Shadow of What Was Lost, An Echo of Things to Come, and The Light of All That Falls, I figured if anything deserves a proper book review, it is this gigantic trilogy. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to start by giving a very brief synopsis of the world in the start of the first book. Then I'm going to give an overview of the type of books that these are. Then I'm going to examine the interesting themes this trilogy covers. Then I'm going to argue that the books were poorly written from a technical point of view. And then I'm going to wrap up with my overall feelings and ratings of the trilogy. I have 3 pages of notes to cover, so let us not waste any time and let's get into it. So let's start off with just the briefest of synopses, just so that I don't end up spoiling any plot points. Essentially, we have a fantasy world here where there's a kind of a caste system that is determined by an individual's ability to use magic. So about a generation before the events of these books take place, the caste system was sorted such that at the very top tier were the augurs, and these were the people who had the most magic using ability. And they were also the kind of rulers of the world. Then underneath the augurs were the gifted, and the gifted were people who had a limited amount of magic using ability, and they sort of assisted the augurs with ruling over everybody else. And the bottom tier basically consisted of people who had no magic abilities whatsoever. Now this, like I said, was the situation about a generation before the book started, and what had happened in the meantime was a revolution had occurred where the non-magic users rose up and essentially flipped that system on its head, so that the rulers essentially were the non-magic users. The gifted were kind of tolerated to a certain extent. They were essentially isolated to their own little schools. And then the augurs were eliminated altogether. Essentially, if it was discovered that you were an augur, you were executed. It was a capital crime just to be an augur. So that's essentially the situation we find ourselves in when the book opens up, and we begin the first book, The Shadow of What Was Lost, in one of these schools for the gifted. We are following a few 16-year-olds who are very quickly pulled out of this school on a bit of a quest because they find out that the boundary is weakening. So apparently in the much more distant past, a couple thousand years ago, there was an evil ruler who had risen up and who had collected this army of Banes, who are these monsters, and had attempted to take over the world, but apparently they were pushed back and they were isolated to the far north of the kingdom, and a gigantic boundary was put around their province to contain them so that they couldn't come out into the rest of the kingdom and continue to cause problems. So rumors have gone out that the boundary is weakening and perhaps some of these monsters are being able to slip through. So our 16-year-old protagonists leave the school in search of what is happening with this boundary. That is just the beginning of just tons of massive events that are going to be happening throughout the 3 books, but I don't want to essentially get into any more than that because even the synopsis on the back of the first book spoils one kind of plot point, so I don't want to do that for you. So book 1 here is essentially kind of a journey or quest with these characters setting out to try to discover what's going on. Book 2, An Echo of Things to Come, is more focused on larger political machinations. There's a lot of politics at play in conflicts that are happening on a national level. And then book 3, The Light of All That Falls, eventually gets more into sort of large-scale warfare between nations. So what starts off as kind of a simple-ish sounding quest turns into this big world-changing series of events that happens throughout the trilogy. So that, in a nutshell, is what the books are about. So now we'll look a little more closely at what type of books these are. So obviously, this is a huge, epic high fantasy trilogy. Like I said, each individual book averages out to about 750 pages. So it is a giant fantasy epic that takes place in this world that has a deep history. It has this tiered magic system, like I said, and it has loads of characters and locations. In fact, the character glossary that is in book 3 has 88 characters named in the glossary, which for me is a lot to keep track of. You Wheel of Time readers, with your 2,782 named characters in the Wheel of Time series, might scoff at the 88 characters in the Licanius Trilogy, but for me, that was a lot of people to keep track of. And speaking of that glossary, what really saved me with these books was the fact that each book had a glossary of characters as well as a glossary of other places and things. But at the beginning of books 2 and 3, there was a synopsis of the entire plot of the series up until the start of each book. So that really helped in terms of sorting out everything that was going on. I read the synopsis at the beginning of book 2 and was like, oh, is that what that was all about in book 1? Okay, and then same thing with book 3. I was reading the summary of events of books 1 and 2 and going, oh, okay, I understand some things here that I did not understand previously. So, man, I think all fantasy series need this kind of summary in each book of events that lead up to that point, because it really made things a lot easier from a reader's perspective. It was hard to keep track of all the names of characters and places and creatures and other things. And you know it's an epic fantasy trilogy because of the fantasy naming system that uses words split by apostrophes. I'll give you an example on screen here of several nouns that were part of this series that use this fantasy naming system. Now, the Licanius Trilogy is more plot-driven than character-focused. For the size of the books, there's not a lot of character development that happens with most of the characters. There is, to a certain extent, and there is one major exception. One character named Caden experiences a huge growth arc, which is really one of the most interesting arcs of any character I've ever read. So it feels like all the character development was centered on this one character, and the others felt slightly flat. For instance, our 3 16-year-olds that we start off with are all very good people, and they do good things, and there's not a lot of depth or shades of gray to their characters. If they raise their temper against one of their friends, then a paragraph or two later you'll see them apologizing because they're just these good, sweet people who are just trying to do good in the world. And we don't see much depth or development beyond that. The total events of the 3 books here take place over about a 2-year period roughly. And what's really weird is that these 16, 17-year-old characters act very much like middle-aged adults. We see them taking on major leadership roles within the nations, and we see them doing things that are on a huge scale, and in every way they act like adults, and yet you tend to forget that these are kids who are starting off in a school. So as a result of the general lack of character depth, I found it didn't grow very attached to any of the characters. Now, the way this series is written is through a lot of jumping around in timelines. We have a certain amount of memory loss and memory recovery. So there's a lot of flashbacks, a lot of recovered memories of the past that are happening. And I'll also say that there is time travel involved with the books. It's an important element of the series. And so between the flashbacks, the recovered memories, the time travel, it puts a lot of burden on the reader to keep track of the timeline and the proper sequence of events. It can get very confusing as we're bouncing around between timelines. And I discovered I really just dislike time travel in books, partly as a result of having to keep track of what is going on and when it's happening. My life would certainly be easier if it was more of a linear progression of events, especially in a series of this size with so much stuff that's happening. So in book 1, we see these characters sort of embarking on their adventure. The climax of book 1, without spoiling anything, I gotta say that it had me rolling my eyes pretty hard. So I can't really talk about it without spoiling stuff, so I'll just leave it at that. Book 2 had some much more welcome, lighthearted, and humorous moments, whereas Book 1 and Book 3 were very serious in tone, and I sort of missed the lighthearted moments that we have sprinkled throughout Book 2 to a certain extent. But that, in general, is the overview of these books and the way they're structured. Now, regarding adult content in these books, these have very typical North American Christianity-based morals in that there is no sex, no drinking, no swearing, but loads of graphic, gory violence, which really kind of has always puzzled me, the way we are conditioned in North America to feel that anything related to do with loving each other physically or using certain curse words are terrible things, and yet we have all the room in the world for incredible graphic violence, which is rather strange to me. But the violence, it starts very early in Book 1. It is very graphic. There are body parts going everywhere throughout all 3 books, which doesn't bother me particularly. As somebody who worked as a paramedic for 16 years, I kind of have a strong stomach for anything related to biology and physiology getting messed up. That was just kind of part of the work I did. So that sort of thing doesn't affect me too much. As long as it's not sexual violence, that's something I can't stomach. Fortunately, we don't see that in the Licanius Trilogy. What is really strange about the violence in these books, though, are how unaffected the characters are by just all of this incredible violence and death that they experience at the age of 16 and 17. These events that would cause horrible PTSD to any normal person seem to just happen, and then the plot just keeps chugging forward because it's a plot-driven book and it's not really a character-focused story, with that one major exception I talked about. Next up, let's look at some of the themes that are covered in the trilogy, and the books do cover several interesting themes. I'm going to just mention them fairly quickly. I'm not going to dive into any of them in any great depth here. So one theme that it covers is choosing between the better of 2 evils, where can we justify supporting one evil if it's maybe not as bad as another thing? And can we even justify genocide for the greater good of humanity? So can even the most horrible things be justified if we can see the bigger picture and somehow it's the better choice? So that's one thing. Tied to that is the theme of redemption. Can even the most evil person turn themselves around and be redeemed? That in itself could spark a huge discussion, but again, I'm just going to leave it at that and move on to the next one, which is memory, and how memory defines our past and affects our future. Some of the characters we meet in the books, we're really not sure if they can be trusted, whether their motivations are good or not. And there's one character who is suffering from a lot of memory loss, who isn't even sure if he can trust himself. He doesn't really know what kind of person he was in the past and whether he can trust himself going forward. So those are interesting themes related to memory. Next up, we have checks and balances on power. How do we ensure that those who have power wield it responsibly? There's a constant struggle throughout these books of people who are in power, who are trying to do things, who are facing opposition from people who want to limit their power. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it hinders good progress being made, so it's an interesting thing to examine. We also have the trope of found family. Who are our true loved ones in life, especially when we don't necessarily have a traditional family? Who are those friends in our lives who we can lean on and consider to be our family? And then the final theme, which I'll dive into by reading some passages from the books here, is one of religion and faith. And what's slightly disappointing to me is the fact that the religion in the Licanius Trilogy is pretty much a carbon copy of Christianity. So we're examining some uniquely Christian themes here, which you'll see in a second, including one of the biggest themes in the book, which is the idea of free will versus fate. Does God or the gods determine everything that happens in our lives to the point where we don't have real free will? Or do the gods give us freedom to choose for ourselves what happens, and not necessarily have a predestined path for us. So if you're familiar at all with Christian theology, this is sort of the old Calvinism versus Arminianism debate. But another interesting question that's asked throughout the book is it possible for a god or gods to be flawed? If a god is just somebody who has unimaginably more power than us, does that mean they are perfect beings? Or do they perhaps have the same flaws that we have, even though we don't have the same power as they do? Now let me read a couple of things just to illustrate what I'm talking about with the whole idea of religion in this trilogy. And if you're familiar with Christianity, you'll definitely see the parallels here, I think. So the god in the book is named El, E-L, and the devil character is named Shemaloth. A character named Nihim says, "My belief is in El, the one God." The other character that Nihim's talking to replies and says, "The god of the augurs, the god of predestination." That's right, Nihim sounded surprised at Caden's knowledge. El sees everything, is in perfect and absolute control. The grand design, it's called. Everything that happens runs according to his purpose. There was a pause, Caden obviously digesting this. "I can't say I like the idea of not being in control of my own destiny," he said eventually. "If everything is already laid out, if there really is a grand design, wouldn't that mean we have no free will?" Nihim grunted. "I can't tell you how many times I heard that same question debated back in the Augur's day," he admitted. "There are a lot of differing opinions, but I certainly think we have free will. Just because El knows each choice I'm going to make, even if he created me knowing it's the choice I would make, doesn't mean it's not mine." He sighed. "But perhaps it's still not free will as you would think of it. That's the natural arrogance of man, sadly. We want to believe that free will means complete independence from the plans of our Creator." So you can see here this debate happening between the ideas of predestination, the grand design, versus free will and having choice in life. So let's take a break from the deep theological issues for a second, and I just want to let you know that this video is brought to you by my Patreon supporters. And I really can't express my thank you enough, especially to my higher tier Patreon supporters, Joanna, Paul, and Mojo. And let's get back to the Licanius Trilogy. The next thing I'm going to look at is the fact that the writing in these books is downright bad from a technical perspective. Let me get into this a bit. And I hate to be critical, and this is why I don't usually do proper reviews, because I don't like criticizing the artistic works of other people, especially when I'm not a published author myself. And I want to be clear that I'm talking strictly from a technical point of view. From the point of view of storytelling, this is an absolute masterpiece in terms of the world that's created, the story that's told, how it's all woven together. I could never in a million years write a series of this caliber in terms of the storytelling aspect of things. It's the technical things that really bugged me. Less than 100 pages into book one, I was already tabbing passages that made me cringe so hard I was spraining my teeth. And I was really hoping it was just going to be a problem with book one, because the author had self-published the first book initially. Wikipedia says that James Islington, the author, received multiple rejections and decided to self-publish the novel. But then within a year of self-publishing, Islington signed a deal with Orbit Books to publish a physical copy. And I was really hoping that books 2 and 3, having been signed by a publisher, I assumed that editors would go through them and would fix up all the problems I was running into in book one, but for whatever reason that wasn't the case. And I'm going to give several examples just so you know I'm not trashing the book for no good reason here. And I'm not, and again, I'm not trying to trash the book, I'm just trying to make a point about the writing style. So I've done a little bit of studying on how to write. A great book on the topic is Stephen King's book called On Writing. And then, of course, I've looked up articles online, especially ones where authors give their how to write tips. And one of the things you most commonly see when it comes to writing dialogue is just write he said, or she said, or they said. Don't expand on that any further. Don't add adverbs except in the most rare situations. Just keep it simply he said, she said, they said. Because if you don't, you very quickly get to the point where you're over-explaining things as an author, and you're kind of assuming that your reading audience is not very smart to pick up on things themselves, and you'll see what I mean here when I give some examples. So these first few come from early in book 1 here. This is Davian talking. He says, "I know, but the boundary is a long way north. We were always going to have to go further, and if the Signari are in Desriel, that's where I need to go. He hadn't come this far to turn back. If you don't want to come, though, I will understand." That whole sentence, he hadn't come this far to turn back, I don't know why that's been inserted in here. That's obviously what's being portrayed by what the character is saying. Here's another example. "Death breaks the bond," an impatient-sounding Brishada said by way of explanation, seeing Davian's expression. That very first bit here, an impatient-sounding Brishada said, could have been just Brishada said, full stop. We don't need by way of explanation. Obviously it's by way of explanation. She's explaining things. And she sees Davian's expression. Sure, that isn't necessary. In the next example here, it's a bit of a longer one so you can get a better picture of what I'm trying to talk about here. "Davian squinted, trying to better see the wagon. It was solidly built, more so than normal. Instead of the traditional canvas roof, it had one of sturdy wood, making it look like a large box on wheels." So right off the bat, we're talking about a wagon. The "more so than normal" is an awkward statement in there. "The only window visible was a small slit at the front, crisscrossed with thick steel bars that glinted in the firelight. After a moment, Davian realized that a heavy wooden beam lay across the door, clearly to prevent anyone on the inside from getting out." If it's clear, we don't need to over-explain that. Obviously, if there's a wooden beam laying across the door, it's to prevent people from getting in or out. That's over-explained. "You're right," he said, biting his lip. Quick pause there. If you want to be well hydrated, take a drink of water every time a character in this series bites their lip. My goodness, all the characters do it all the time. Also take a drink of water every time a male character is described as having a scarred face. You'll be very well hydrated. "You're right," he said, biting his lip. "Whoever we're looking for must be locked in there." "Wonderful," Weir sighed, but didn't dispute Davian's statement, evidently having come to the same conclusion himself. Obviously, if it's evident, you don't have to over-explain it. The worst adverb that keeps coming up in these books is in the next section here. "Asha bit her lip." Another character biting her lip, of course. "And maybe after a while he might let slip why it's so important to him too." "Exactly. Which you can then relay back to us," the Shadrahin smiled. "Once we know the details, we can hopefully use the information to force the North Warden's hand, get him to have administration back off. And we would find a way to do it without implicating you, of course," he quickly assured her. "He said" would be fine there. We don't need "he quickly assured her." The Shadrahin nodded. "I know, and I won't force you to be a part of this," he said seriously. That's the one that always gets me, is so many times it's stated that the character said seriously, as if they're not being serious. This whole book, their characters are being serious. You don't have to say that he said seriously. That one really irritates me in particular. Here's a couple just to finish up from the last book here. "You need to rest," added Neha to Tal, this time without any hint of playfulness in her voice. She studied Davian assessingly. Studied Davian assessingly. How else are you going to study somebody without assessing them? It's repetitious, unnecessary, over-explained. Okay, one last one here, then I'll drop the subject. "I can't sustain even this for much longer," said Tal bluntly, the words a grim warning to hurry. Get rid of everything after said Tal. We don't need to know he said it bluntly. And we obviously know that the words are a grim warning to hurry. That's why he said those exact words. We don't need that explained to us. Skipping forward a few paragraphs. "What about Raeleth?" asked Neha apprehensively. Get rid of apprehensively. Davian shook his head. "I don't know," he said simply, addressing the statement to Raeleth. Again, get rid of the simply. He said, she said. That's all you need. There you go. From a technical point of view, I kept being pulled out of the story by these little things that irritated me. Now, getting away from the technical side of things to the story itself, here's another thing that was really bothersome, and that was the fact that in book 3, there's a kind of a side story arc going on between two characters named Aelric and Desia, who sort of go off on their own little quest to do stuff. Again, don't want to spoil anything. And then they're just gone from the story. And way down the line, towards the end of book 3, all of a sudden they pop back up. They've finished doing what they're doing. A lot of stuff has happened. It has been implied. But it's a whole side thing that just disappeared from the story. And the author actually addresses it after the story's finished and the acknowledgments are written. There's a couple of pages here titled Author's Note, Aelric and Desia, wherein the author goes to explain that, yeah, I know I just dropped that whole thread, that whole storyline, and the reason is, if I had taken the time to explain everything that happened, the books were already long, and I would have had to turn it into a 4-book series instead of a trilogy. And plus, this was all happening towards the end as the climax was happening, and it might have taken characters away from the climax, and all that stuff makes sense to me. And yet, I think it could have been made to work, and I would have really liked to hear that story, to understand what happened, and to make sense of exactly what was going on after those unwritten events occurred. You would have had to really hear a lot more about it. And the reason it could have worked is because the author ended up, throughout the course of the 3 books, kind of circling back to the point where in book 3, we end up experiencing some very similar events in the exact same place that happened in book 1. And when we were in book 3, I'm sitting there going, we've already read this all before. This has all kind of happened before, and here we are. We've circled back around, and it's happening again. And I'm like, you could have just tightened up that story, gotten rid of the repetition, and you would have had time to tell the story of Aelric and Desia and what all they had gotten up to and why this stuff came out of the blue near the end of book 3 that made you go, what on earth did these two get up to for all this to have happened? So that was, from my point of view, a really poor choice from the writing side of things too. But let's leave all that behind, and let's wrap it up now, finally, by talking about my overall feelings and giving the books a rating. So book 1, I felt, was kind of the most fun for me because it felt like we were setting out on a bit of a quest or an adventure. There was a mystery going on with what was the deal with this boundary, was it weakening, what was going on there. Book 2 started to get heavier and deeper as we explored larger things within the world, but it did have those nice moments of levity and humor that I appreciated. But book 3 is where that repetition I was talking about came in, where it felt like characters were just doing what they had always been doing. By about midway through the 3rd book, I felt like here I am almost 2,000 pages into the trilogy, and I don't know what we've actually accomplished so far. We've certainly learned some information, but we're still sort of pursuing the same things that we were from the beginning of book 1 pretty much. And honestly, it just kind of dragged, and the feeling I had when I finished up book 3 was just kind of relief that it was finally done. Which is obviously not what you're aiming for with a book. You want to be sad that you're no longer in this world, that your time with these characters is over. But like I said, I never felt super connected to the characters, and I was just kind of glad that it was over. So overall, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably rate the Licanius Trilogy a 6 out of 10 for my personal tastes. But if you're somebody who loves a big high fantasy story with a deep world and lots of action, and you're not intimidated by dozens and dozens of characters and places and big intertwining events, I think you would love the Licanius Trilogy. If that's the type of thing you enjoy reading, I don't want any of my negative points to dissuade you from checking out the books. Because like I said, I feel like James Islington has done a masterful job from a storytelling perspective of weaving together this tale. Even though some things could have been done better, this is a first-time author, and what he's succeeded in doing is really quite remarkable. If you've read this trilogy or any of the books in it, I would love to hear what you have to say about it. And if not, I just want to know what you're reading right now, because that is something that always interests me. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. Where the essentially he's looking at the character, get a good man to utter get a good man to utter either of these. Oh my God. It's